Let's take a look at another argument, which is, we're going to see is not exactly a great argument. In fact, I've kind of titled the slide Bad Arguments. And here's the argument we want to look at. Drugs should be legal. After all, those who use drugs only harm themselves. I mean, it's certainly an argument you've heard on the news or heard on the street, heard people discussing. The question is this a good argument? Now, in evaluating it, what's the first, or in analyzing it, what's the first thing that we have to do? Step number one, reconstruct it. Okay, well, what is the conclusion? And kind of a hint that you should get is that after all, after all, it sounds like they're giving you what follows the after all are reasons for thinking that drugs should be legal. So it looks like the conclusion is drugs should be legal. And now, what are the premises, or what is the premise in this case? Drugs only hurt those who use them. Okay, so drugs only hurt those who use them, therefore drugs should be legal. Now, if we look at this particular argument, we're going to find that a critic of this argument, that is, somebody who thinks drugs should be legalized, doesn't like this argument, right? Somebody thinks marijuana, for example, should be legalized, thinks this is a bad argument. Well, what's wrong with it? And a critic, somebody who thinks there's something wrong with this argument, might criticize the argument in one of two ways. And let's go back to kind of our definition of what makes something a good argument, and if it doesn't meet those criteria, those characteristics, it obviously is not a good argument. The first one is the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. In other words, it's not valid. Not valid is an invalid argument. Remember, we're only using valid for arguments now. Don't let me hear you say that a premise is not valid. You know, that's a demerit. Points off on the test. So in this case, somebody might say, gee, that conclusion that drugs should be legal doesn't follow from the fact that they only hurt those who use them. But I think if you look at it and you're going to be a critic of this, and I think there's a lot to criticize in this argument, not necessarily, and this doesn't really show that there's something wrong with taking the position that we should have laws prohibiting drugs, including marijuana. I'm not taking either side of the issue, but the only point I'm saying is this particular argument is not a good one. First of all, it's not valid, and the second reason is the premise happens to be false. I mean, one would try to explain why the premise is false by pointing out things like the fact that oftentimes drug users hurt their friends, their families are very negatively affected, that it has very bad consequences for them. Now, some of you are now getting your, what I might say, your bowels in an uproar. You're getting yourselves upset. Oh, well, you know, because you want to defend the position that maybe marijuana should be legalized. However, anything that you're going to say is going to be talking about a different argument, because remember, when we're analyzing arguments, we're talking about a particular reconstruction. Now, maybe you're going to want to say, well, this isn't really what the guy had in mind. He had another argument in mind. That's okay, and that's, you know, a fair criticism, or maybe a fair criticism of analyzing the argument in this way, but that opens the door to reconstructing a slightly different argument, or reconstructing what you think the argument is in a slightly different way, and then evaluating that argument. And notice, I mean, we're being pretty insistent. We want you to reconstruct the argument in this particular way because we make it really clear what we're talking about. If we're talking about a different argument, okay. If there's a better argument, great. If the guy actually proposed this but really had something else in mind, it's something for us to consider.